Chapter 131, 7th Year, Interlude. Tuesday, 24th of January, 1978, 7:50 a.m. James woke them on Tuesday morning, calling through the curtains. "Oi, Padfoot, get up! Nearly 8, you lazy sod!" "I've got a free study day, arsehole, piss off!" Sirius groaned in reply, burying his head under his pillow. "You'll miss breakfast!" "Fine, starve then," James replied. Then, "Seen Moony? His bed's empty. Don't think he should be off on his own, do you?" Sirius lifted the pillow from his face and looked at Remus, raising an eyebrow in question. Remus stared back in panic. Okay, James knew, but so far they'd managed to avoid his having any actual encounters with their relationship. Remus was very particular about it. He didn't want to be gawked at. He wanted to prove that everything was just the same as before, and that meant what happened between him and Sirius in private ought to be kept, well, private. He'd been fastidious about bed sharing, making sure they got up early and crept back to his own bed, or else rumple his bed sheets and head straight for the shower. But it was the full moon and he was slower than usual. "Probably gone for breakfast, mate," Sirius called back. He shrugged at Remus. "Yeah, maybe," James agreed. "Oh, hang on, I'll check the map. He's left it on his bedside table." Remus slapped his head, astounded by his own stupidity. "I'm in here, James," he shouted quickly, feeling himself turn red with embarrassment. "Oh!" They heard James stop still just outside the bed curtains. "Oh, right, of course. Sorry. I didn't think." His steps receded quickly toward the door. "Sorry, lads. See you later, eh?" The door slammed shut. Sirius snorted with laughter as Remus crawled under the sheets as if he could escape the embarrassment there. "Oh, come on," Sirius laughed, trying to pull the sheets back. "It wasn't that bad." "It was horrible," Remus replied, burying himself further. "I'll never be able to look him in the eye again." Sirius crawled under the sheets too, chasing him. "It's not like we were doing anything. You've still got your pyjamas on." "Prongs doesn't know that," Remus retorted, sitting cross-legged, facing Sirius. It was like they were under their own little tent now, and reminded Remus of camping. That was such a nice memory that he felt a bit calmer. Even better, Sirius always held his hand when they were hidden away like this, and he reached out now, playing with Remus's long, scarred fingers as though they were precious treasure. "I don't see what the fuss is about," Sirius mused, lacing his soft white fingers between Remus's, then splaying them out, then wiggling them, like a children's game. "I'm sure he already assumes some things." "See, you can't see it either." "Well, I'm a gentleman," Sirius smirked, looking up at him now. Even in the dark, Remus could feel Sirius's eyes burning. He was biting his lip, too. Remus gave a little sigh, and Sirius quirked an eyebrow. "At least we know we've got this room to ourselves." He placed a hand on each of Remus's knees and leaned in. Remus kissed him but pushed away. "No way! If we don't go down there right now, James is definitely going to think we're shagging." "Being physically intimate," Remus said piously. Sirius burst out laughing again and rolled onto the bed. "Oh, Moony, you kill me! What happened to that rough little yob I used to know?" "Some posh boy taught him how to read," Remus replied dryly, flinging back the covers and rubbing the static out of his curls. "Right, quick shower, then we'll go down." He jumped out of bed, wincing a bit at the bright sunlight filling the dorm room. "I like the sound of that," Sirius called from the bed as Remus crossed the floor. In the bathroom doorway he turned and gave Sirius his most withering look. "Downstairs, pervert." 8:30 a.m. James couldn't quite look at either of them in the eye as it happened, much to Sirius's amusement. Peter had his head down too, quietly shoveling porridge into his mouth, and for a horrifying moment Remus wondered whether he'd told James exactly what he had seen in their bedroom only a few short days ago. That would be too much to come back from, Remus was sure. He distracted himself by listening to Mary talk, which was always easy to do. She was going out with a boy on the Hufflepuff Quidditch team these days, and was simultaneously extolling his virtues and bemoaning the pitfalls of seeing an athlete. Remus couldn't help but think that Mary was preaching to the choir a bit, as of course Lily, and, if Sirius was to be believed, Marlene were both going out with Quidditch players too. "I mean, he's fit, like Adonis level," she gushed dreamily. "And talk about stamina." Marlene was rolling her eyes, and James was staring fixedly at his cup of tea, while Lily giggled behind her hands. Mary was gloriously oblivious, in her element. "But then he has the gall to whine about thigh chafing from his bloody broom," she cackled. James's ears had turned bright red, and Sirius was trying to catch his eye, a manic grin on his face. Mary carried on. "I told him if he thinks that's uncomfortable, he should try bleeding from his snatch 5 days a month." Peter practically choked on his porridge, Lily covered her face, and Marlene slammed her hand on the table. "Fucking hell, Mary, do you have to?" "What?" Mary sat up, blinking, looking as though butter wouldn't melt on her wicked tongue. "Well, you're being a bit graphic for the breakfast table," Lily said diplomatically. "We're adults, aren't we?" Mary arched an eyebrow. "We're mature enough to talk about sex." "Right, I'd better be off." James leapt to his feet, uncharacteristically clumsy, rattling the table as he did so. Lily looked up at him, surprised. "Where are you going?" "Potions!" "It's not for another 15... Okay, wait, I'll come with you." She got up, still giving her boyfriend a strange look, and they left together. "Didn't know James was such a prude," Mary commented. "No, it wasn't you, MacDonald," Sirius explained, stretching his arms over his head and tousling his long hair. "Prongsy boy just had a bit of a surprise this morning." "Ow!" Remus had kicked him sharply under the table. Marlene watched them both, sipping her tea with a knowing look. Fortunately, at that moment, the post owl swooped into the great hall, and a large barn owl dropped 2 letters in front of Remus's plate. He snatched them up eagerly. One was a postcard from Grant, forwarded on via the Potters, with a lewd cartoon on the front depicting a man on the seashore holding an enormous red stick of Brighton rock against his crotch. The back read, "Saw this and thought of you. Looking at flats next week. Love." Remus grinned at this and handed it to Sirius, who scowled comically. The second letter was from Professor Ferox, with a list of book recommendations Remus had requested on the history of the magical creatures classification system. They'd been writing back and forth since Christmas. It seemed Ferox was bored with his recuperation, finding himself at a loose end. Sirius watched Remus finish reading the letter. "Anything from..." he asked, giving a significant look. Remus shook his head. Nothing from his mother. Sirius tried to flash him a cheering smile. "Still time, eh?" Remus just shrugged. "Going to go to the library to see if I can find any of these before History of Magic." He held up Ferox's list. "See you later, girls." He nodded at Mary and Marlene. "See you in the hospital wing this evening?" Marlene asked hopefully. Ah, Remus remembered. It was Tuesday. He hadn't been attending the healing lessons Madame Pomfrey had kindly included him in for weeks now, too busy memorizing curses. He didn't really want to go this evening, it being a full moon, but he looked at Marlene and felt guilty. "Of course," he nodded. "See you then." Sirius bounded happily alongside Remus as he made his way to the library, mentally working through his timetable for the day. He only had 3 classes, luckily, but he'd promised to catch up with Christopher at some point, and he wanted to write back to both Grant and Ferox, and he had an arithmancy essay due. "Moony! Earth calling planet Moony!" Sirius interrupted his thoughts. "We just walked past the library, if that's where you were heading." "Oh, bollocks!" Remus turned 180 degrees and started back, Sirius still in tow. "Care to share?" "Oh, nothing, just thinking." "Not worrying, I hope, about tonight?" A bit." They entered the library and had to be quiet as they passed Madame Pince's desk. He'd actually been trying not to think about the coming moon. After all, Dumbledore had said not to. He'd said the Order was dealing with it, and Remus could only hope that that meant Alistair Moody was on the case, which made him feel slightly better. Still, Castor's warning had been ringing in his ears since Saturday, and it was impossible to forget. "I don't think we ought to leave the shack tonight," Remus whispered. "If anything happens." "It won't. Dumbledore's dealing with it," Sirius replied, leaning against the nearest bookcase casually, while Remus looked for the text he wanted. Remus had to stop himself from tutting. James and Sirius put so much faith in Dumbledore, he often wondered whether he was missing something. But then Remus trusted very few people over the age of 18, with good reason. "I know," he said calmly, "but I'd like you to respect my wishes if it's all the same to you." "Hey, don't be like that," Sirius chided gently. "Of course we will. Anything for our Moony." Remus found 3 of the books on Ferox's list, which cheered him up a bit. He then took to Madame Pince, then began to tuck them in his bag. "I'll take them," Sirius offered, holding out his hands. "You don't want to be lugging them around all day. I'm going back to the dorm anyway." "Oh, cheers." Remus handed them over. "Are you going to start on that arithmancy essay?" "Not if I can possibly avoid it." Sirius pulled a face. "See you at lunch. You're free this afternoon, aren't you?" Yeah, but I'm supposed to be seeing Christopher. Then there's that essay you're not doing, and healing class. And I really want to write back to Ferox today, if I can. I think he likes getting the post, since he's not allowed out much." "Merlin, Remus," Sirius was shaking his head. "You've got to be at the shack by 6. "I'm aware," Remus replied offhandedly, adjusting his book bag. It really could do with another mending spell. Unless you held it just right, the seam started splitting. "And are you planning to eat?" Sirius continued. "When have I ever forgotten a meal?" Remus poked his tongue out. "Anyway, I've got to run. History. See you at lunch." 1:50 p.m. In spite of his promises, Remus was extremely late for lunch and had missed everyone except Sirius, who'd waited back. "Sorry," Remus gasped as he reached the table, a little breathless from running. He sat down. "Stayed back to talk to Kettleburn, then remembered I'd forgotten my notes in Professor Binns' room. History was a bloody waste, too. All the stuff I've covered in the reading. Oh, thank you." Sirius had pushed a plate of sausage and mash across the table to him. Remus dug in, eating and talking as quickly as he could. They only had 10 minutes before lunch was over, and the school choir would want the hall for their weekly practice sessions. "Anyway, it worked out nicely in the end. I used the time to write my letter to Ferox and a note for Grant, so at least that's done. What's that?" Sirius slid a stack of parchment across the table now. Remus drained his glass of pumpkin juice and looked at it. "Arithmancy?" "Your essay," Sirius said casually. "Finished mine like a good boy, so I thought I'd do yours too." "You what?" Remus did a double take. Sirius was ridiculously good with a quill and had mimicked his own spidery handwriting perfectly. "I don't believe you." "How many times have you done it for Wormy? Or James, for that matter? He's still got a stick up his arse about this morning, by the way. Won't talk to me about it. Anyway, now that's done, and the letters, you're free for the afternoon." "Thanks so much, Padfoot. Honestly, this is brilliant. But I did promise to see Christopher and—" "Nope." Sirius was grinning like the cat who'd got the cream. "Just saw him. Told him you weren't well, so you couldn't see him." "Sirius?" "Well, you're not well," Sirius responded innocently. "What with tonight, you ought to be resting." "I'll be fine once I've eaten," Remus replied shortly, eyes on his food, mopping up the last of the gravy with his mashed potato. He'd lick the plate if he was shameless enough. Full moons made him ravenous. When he'd finished, he looked up and found Sirius staring at him, big eyes full of puppyish remorse. "Angry with me?" "No." Remus wiped his mouth with his sleeve and pushed his plate away in time for it to vanish back down to the kitchens. "But you can't reorganize my life like that just to get your own way." "I didn't mean it like that." Sirius sat up, looking shocked. You've always got so much going on, and it's insane. I mean, it's amazing because you're amazing, and you can handle it, but you don't have to." "Okay." Remus frowned, getting up. He wasn't sure exactly what Sirius was saying. He'd always tried to keep busy. He liked being busy and useful to people. "And you'd written so many notes for that essay, it practically wrote itself," Sirius continued as they left the great hall and began to head for Gryffindor Tower. "And we can go and find Christopher if you want. He's probably in the library." "Sirius?" Remus sighed fondly. "Go on, I'll post the letters for you, and I'll see you for early dinner." "Sirius." He checked the coast was clear, everyone was in lessons, and Peeves wasn't about. An empty corridor was a rare thing at Hogwarts. "Oh, bugger!" Sirius slapped his forehead. I can't do early dinner. I've got that detention with Filch. Only for an hour, though, so I'll be out in time for... Sirius! What? He finally stopped talking in time for Remus to catch him unawares with a quick kiss on the lips. Shut up, you idiot, he smiled. I'd much rather spend the afternoon with you than studying with Christopher. Oh, Sirius blushed, looking very pleased. 2:15 p.m. Less than 20 minutes later, and Remus was completely blissed out, lying on his back with the record player at his feet and Sirius's head resting against his good hip. Bowie was singing and strumming his 8-string, and the two boys listening were sharing a spliff Sirius had charmed off a Ravenclaw earlier that week. Does the wolf get stoned too? Sirius asked, reaching for his turn. Remus shook his head, inhaling deeply and passing the joint. Hungrier, probably, he replied, voice high. Sirius murmured. Remus exhaled and closed his eyes, settling back on the pile of cushions. It was like sinking into warm treacle. He let his thoughts drift. Can I ask you something? He mumbled. Fire away, Moony. What was Mary on about this morning? About the Hufflepuff Keeper's stamina? I think she was bragging, to be honest with you. Not that, Remus chuckled. The bleeding thing. Bleeding from her... What did she mean? Sirius swiveled his head in Remus's lap to look up at him, wearing a bemused frown. She was talking about, her time of the month. He raised his eyebrows as if Remus was supposed to catch on somehow. What's that? Remus frowned back, none the wiser. Remus, seriously? What? Girls are different from boys. Well, I know that, Remus bristled, feeling defensive now. Okay, so girls get this thing every month, Sirius began to explain. Remus was utterly horrified by the time he'd finished. That's the most disgusting thing I've ever heard, he said flatly. It's natural, Sirius shrugged. I'll get Lily to explain it to you. I probably told it wrong. Bloody hell, you're nearly 18. How did you not know? Oh yeah, make fun of the care home kid, Remus tutted. I grew up in a boys' reformatory. How am I supposed to know anything about girls? Explains a lot, Sirius said dryly. Remus flicked his ear sharply. Ow! What's your detention for, anyway? Remus asked, settling back again. Hexed Crouch. Oh, right. Him and my darling brother were tormenting some second years, but obviously he got out of it because he's a prefect, Sirius muttered darkly. He never said Regulus's name anymore, just my darling brother, in that cruel, overly plummy accent which Remus thought was probably to make fun of Regulus's poshness. Except, and Remus would never say this out loud, for the first few years Remus had known Sirius, he'd had exactly the same clipped received enunciation. Ought to try and ignore them if you can, Remus advised. I know he bothers you, but it's best just to stay out of his way. School's over soon. I know, Sirius said, hogging the spliff. Remus reached for it, snatching his wrist. God, he loved Sirius's wrists. The bones were so fine, the veins like blue ribbon under translucent skin. His own fingers wrapped all the way around easily. He held it now and pulled Sirius's hand to his mouth, sucking the end of the joint, then letting him go. Sirius just smirked up at him. The record stopped, and he had to flip it to the B-side. I suppose I just don't want him to hurt anyone, he sighed, settling back down. That's not your job, Remus frowned. Feels like it, Sirius muttered, stretching. You don't know what he was like when we were kids. He's not... I don't know. I just don't want him to do something he'll regret later on. Remus thought very hard, which was no mean feat after a full lungfuls of Ravenclaw-grown hash. Tell you something? He asked. A secret? Sirius replied eagerly, getting up to sit beside him. Sort of. But it's about Regulus. You might not want to hear it. Sirius went a bit quiet, a bit more rigid, but he nodded. Go on. Remember the boggart that got me and Chris before Christmas? How could I forget? Sirius replied, a note of jealousy in his voice. Wish I'd been there. Never seen a boggart. Werewolves not exciting enough for you now? Remus raised his eyebrows. Anyway, I checked the map right before Chris went to get someone, and, well, I'm pretty sure it was Regulus who put the Boggart there. He and Barty were nearby. Remus craned his neck slightly so he could see Sirius's face and how he was taking the news. His mouth was a straight line. He looked more tired than angry. He shook his head. Stupid prick, he muttered. It's all her, you know. He's an idiot for wanting to please her, obviously. But it's all her fault anyway. Your mother? Sirius nodded. Remus didn't know what to say. They'd agreed long ago they could talk about anything but mothers, and that's the way it had been, on Sirius's side anyway. Remus didn't want to go into it now either. Everything was so nice and warm, and if they could just hang on to it a bit longer, then this would be such a good memory, something he would have inside him forever. He reached over and stroked Sirius's cheek, that perfect jawline. He sat up and shifted round to face him. Let's forget all about that shit, he said. It's boring. Sirius kissed him. 4 p.m. Remus walked down alone for dinner at 4, as Sirius left for his detention. It was so early that Remus was the only one there, except for Marlene, who was also attending Madame Pomfrey's healing class. I'm so glad you're coming, she beamed at him. Marlene smiled a lot these days. I haven't seen you properly since Christmas. Yeah, sorry, Remus replied, beginning his second helping of lasagna, twice as big as his first. Been so busy with NEWT stuff. I really wanted to talk to you about what happened on the train. Oh, Remus stared at her, fork halfway to his mouth. With all the fuss about Castor and the full moon, Remus had been able to avoid talking about their strange meeting with Yasmin and Marlene on the train. He felt guilty again. Obviously Marlene had been thinking about it a lot. Hang on, Marlene was saying, reaching for her wand. Muffliato, she murmured. The noise in the hall round them seemed to deaden slightly. What was that? He asked, keeping his voice low. Stops people listening in, Marlene explained. Lily taught it to us. Mary uses it to gossip all the time in charms. Wow, Remus nodded appreciatively. So anyway, Marlene leaned forward on her elbows, eyes bright. You and Sirius, does anyone know? Oh! Remus finally set down his fork and knife, though he could have happily kept going. Yeah, actually. James and Peter, Lily too. Really? Yeah, he nodded, checking that there was definitely nobody listening. Only recently, though. What about you and Yaz? No one, she said firmly. Not even Mary? Least of all her, Marlene said ruefully. Remus decided not to inquire further. He'd had enough revelations concerning Mary for one day. How long has it been going on, you two? He asked. I had no idea. Sorry, Marlene blushed, looking down. I've known I was different, I suppose, for a long time now, and I really wanted to say something to you, especially after the summer, but I dunno. How do you bring it up? Tell me about it, Remus agreed eagerly. Yaz's been my girlfriend since just before Christmas. She's incredible. Marlene was smiling again, and Remus could practically feel the joy radiating from her. He touched her hand gently and said, I'm really happy for you. Thanks. She squeezed his hand back. But what about you? More to the point, what about Sirius? What about him? I'm just flabbergasted, really. Is he fully queer or more AC/DC? I haven't asked. We don't really talk about that sort of thing. You don't? She gave him an odd sideways glance. Doesn't it bother you, his history with girls? No. Remus found himself growing hot under the collar. This was exactly the sort of thing he wanted to avoid discussing with anyone. It's not relevant. Okay, Marlene shrugged, though she looked unconvinced. If it works, I suppose. He didn't respond to that, and eventually the Muffliato spell wore off and they finished eating before making their way to their healing class at 4:30. Marlene was planning to tell Mary, she said, when the time was right. Remus knew that argument well enough, and didn't think it was really his place to offer advice. It was nice to know that someone else knew how he felt at least, even just for a little bit. The healing class passed very slowly. Remus found that he was still pretty stoned, plus quite full, which made him sleepy. He tried to listen to Madame Pomfrey's lecture on circulatory diagnostic spells, but his mind kept wandering, drifting back to his bed and Sirius. The kindly nurse assumed he was just out of it because the moon was close, and didn't chastise him as she usually might. He ought to have felt bad about it, but he was just too happy daydreaming to worry much. 6:30 p.m. Remus hung back in the hospital wing and sat quietly in Madame Pomfrey's office while she tidied a few things away, before the pair of them made their journey down to the shack together. There would only be 4 more full moons at Hogwarts after this one, Remus realised. He knew he would miss Poppy Pomfrey more than he could ever tell her. She would always be the first person who'd ever tried to make him feel comfortable, the first person who ever thought they could help. She bid him goodbye and promised to return first thing in the morning, as always. He put on the same brave face he used when he was 11 and waved to her cheerily from the bed as she closed the door. Alone, Remus stared at the floor for a bit, trying to recall his afternoon and suppress the growing dread in the pit of his stomach. He got up and paced for a bit, for something to do. In time, the door creaked open once more and James poked his head round the corner. He glanced round the room before entering, looking just as awkward as he had that morning. "Hiya, Moony," he said, pushing his glasses up his nose nervously as he entered. "No Wormtail yet?" "I think he had lines to do for McGonagall," Remus said, sitting on the bed. "Right-o," James nodded. He stood leaning against the wall. They were completely silent for a good 3 minutes. Remus tried not to fidget, but the quiet was pretty unbearable. He and James had never been awkward before. Even after Remus came out, he was the first to swear that nothing had changed. But of course now something really had changed. Something which had shifted and skewed the dynamic. James was generally good at rolling with the punches, but it seemed he had a real blind spot when it came to Sirius Black. "Lily wants to be an animagus now," James said suddenly, clearly trying to crack the tension. "Of course she does," Remus smiled fondly. "Bet she masters it in half the time you lot took." "You're not wrong," James laughed appreciatively. But that only hit a dead end, and silence invaded the space between them once more. Remus swallowed and watched James, who was looking at his feet. He'd just made up his mind to speak, to make some joke or ask about Quidditch, when James looked up suddenly, catching his eye. "Look, Moony, I'm really sorry about this morning," he said, all in a rush, as if he'd been holding his breath. Remus blinked. "You're sorry?" "Yeah, I should have realised. You know, you two are, together, going out, whatever. I shouldn't have been so surprised." "It's okay, Prongs," Remus said kindly. "I'm sorry, we've been trying not to rub it in your face too much, and I swear nothing was happening this morning. I just sleep there sometimes." "See, that's what I mean. You shouldn't really have to sneak around," James burst out. "Really, it's not a problem. You should sleep where you want to sleep." Okay. Thank you," Remus nodded. "I don't want things to be weird," James said helplessly. "Me either," Remus insisted. "That's the last thing I want. Sirius too. I just wanted to keep a low profile because, well, he's your best friend and him and me seeing each other. Doesn't that mean—" "I never thought it did," James said hurriedly. He'd crossed the room now, his inherent good nature taking over as he sat down next to Remus on the bed. "And you're my best friend too, Remus." Remus looked down at his hands shyly. "Christ, Potter," he grinned. "Why do you always have to be so perfect?" "Born that way," James shrugged, mirroring Remus's grin. "Come here, Tosser." He pulled him in for a hug. Remus relaxed finally. All was well. At that moment the door swung open once more and Sirius sauntered in the room, closely followed by Peter. "Oi!" Sirius barked, pointing at James. "Hands off my man!" Chapter 132. 7th Year. Victims. The morning after the full moon. Howling, whining, scents, animals, magic, mold. He had to get out, hunt, pack. The big one tried to stop him. The black one tackled him. But he had to get out. He was so hungry. Remus? Remus, wake up! His eyes snapped open as Sirius shook him roughly by the shoulders. What? Are you okay? He was lying on his back on the dusty shack floor. He was bleeding, but he didn't know where from. Sirius was bleeding too. Remus tried to sit up and winced as his head rattled and his back creaked. What happened? He gasped, throat raw from howling or screaming. Here. Sirius helped him up and over to the bed. He pulled out a goblet. Remus didn't know where he got it and whispered, Aguamenti. Sirius's hands were shaking as water poured from his wand, and he handed it to Remus, who drank greedily, spilling it down his front. He knew something was wrong. He could smell the blood and the fear and the sunrise, but it was taking longer than usual for his human thoughts to come back to him, like waking up still drunk with a hangover to boot. What happened? He asked again, frowning. Are you hurt? It's fine. Sirius shook his head. He looked very pale, not his usual aristocratic alabaster, but sickly, worried, yellowish with sweat. You just nipped me a few times. You kept trying to get out. Did I? Remus grabbed him suddenly, pulling his shirt. Sirius pushed him down gently, reaching for blankets to cover him with. He shook his head. No, we kept you here. You never left, I promise you. Where are the others? They had to go. Madame Pomfrey will be here soon. When you turned back, it was different. Harder than normal, I think. You wouldn't wake up properly, so James left me the cloak. I didn't want to leave you here. Remus lay back, his mind racing. He tried to remember, but it was all scrambled up. He only knew one thing for sure. Something really bad happened, he whispered. His own voice was trembling now, and cold dread settled in his stomach like a sickness. Sirius didn't say anything. He just squeezed his hand. He hid under the cloak as soon as Madame Pomfrey arrived, and she hurried in, with a terrible grey look on her face. He sat up, every muscle screaming at him. Poppy, he rasped. What happened? Please tell me. How are you first? She asked, coming over to feel his forehead. You're running very high. I feel fine, he lied, batting her hand away impatiently. There was an attack, wasn't there? She nodded wordlessly. His heart thumped. Who? How many? I don't know, she said very quietly. He'd never heard that voice come out of her before. For a moment she wouldn't even meet his eyes. She'd always looked him in the eye. Please, he said again. She shook her head very slightly. There's nothing I can tell you. It'll be in the morning news. I have to see Dumbledore. He's not here. She stood up. Now, can you walk? Professor McGonagall says you're to go to your lessons as usual if you're fit enough. We don't want anyone asking where you are. I'll give you something for the pain. They walked through the tunnel in silence, with Sirius behind them, still invisible. Madame Pomfrey dealt with the worst of his scratches, mostly from Padfoot, though fortunately she'd assumed he'd done them to himself, and told him to carry on about his day. He took the potion she gave him, but his head still throbbed and his body ached. As soon as she had turned a corner, Sirius revealed himself and slid an arm round Remus's back. Why are you pretending you're okay? He hissed, supporting Remus up the stairs back to their dorm. You can barely walk. I'll be fine in a minute, Remus replied, gritting his teeth. She's got enough to worry about. Ugh, fucking stairs. James said he'd send an owl to his dad right away, Sirius said as they slowly traversed the marble staircase. If anyone knows what's happened, the Potters will. Yeah, Remus nodded, wheezing. Good. But he knew that it was all no good. Whatever had happened, and it had been just as awful as Castor promised. It was the end of any chance of civility for the werewolves. Back in the dorm room, James was still waiting for a reply from his parents. Remus sat out on his bed, heavily, chest heaving, every part of him aching, his skin on fire. You should just bonk off, Sirius said awkwardly, glancing at the others. We do it all the time. Remus shook his head. He hauled himself up, clutching the bed frame. Can't risk it. We've got arithmancy first. Snape's in that. If the papers are full of werewolf attacks and I'm not there, what do you want to bet he'll be the first to start stirring? I'm going for a shower, just a minute. He could hear the other 3 Marauders whispering loudly through the bathroom door, but he didn't have the energy to focus on anything except getting through the next 6 hours. He turned on the taps and let the hissing water drown them out. Werewolf attacks. Magical community demands action. Hundreds were affected by a string of brutal werewolf attacks during last night's full moon, which left 15 wizards dead and at least 5 missing, presumed kidnapped. None of the creatures responsible have been identified as yet, and the Aura's office has advised everyone to be on high alert and to consult the published ministry guidelines on identifying and approaching werewolves, which are classified as 5X and considered highly dangerous. The interim Minister for Magic has been criticised for failure to maintain the werewolf register established by Newt Scamander in 1947. Speaking for the opposition, Abraxas Malfoy released a statement in the early hours of this morning. Last night's attacks are further proof that the Ministry is in dire need of reform, and on behalf of the ancient and law-abiding magical families of Great Britain, we demand stricter sanctions on half-humans and other undesirable and potentially dangerous elements. The statement has provoked outrage in what insiders are describing as an increasingly divided ministry. No names, James muttered darkly. That's not good. Protecting the victims' families? Sirius suggested. Since when has the Daily Prophet cared about that? Lily hissed venomously. Since when is the ministry? Careful what you say, Peter whispered, his eyes wide. My cousin who works at the Prophet said they're being sent really strict guidelines on what they can write about the ministry, the war, anything. And there are spies everywhere checking on them, making sure no one's being too critical. This made everyone go quiet, and Lily looked round nervously, glancing over her shoulder. It didn't matter. Everyone in the Great Hall seemed to be talking about the same thing, huddled in groups over newspapers, whispering amongst themselves. It's not as if we're disagreeing with what the paper says, Marlene whispered, leaning forward. I hate Malfoy's politics as much as the next half-blood, but he's right about the failures of the register. The werewolves need to be contained, or stuff like this will happen, Dark Lord or not. That's ridiculous, Sirius scoffed. An organised attack like this only happens when there's someone behind it. This would never happen without Voldemort goading them. Everyone winced as he said the name. Remus had noticed that happening more and more, as the list of missing grew and people trusted each other less. They're still dangerous, Marlene replied. I don't see why we're pretending they aren't. It says right here. She jabbed the black and white print. Classified 5X. I know it's unfortunate for them, but they might have been perfectly normal otherwise. But facts are facts. No one said anything to that. Remus was doing his best to ignore all of them. He was busy writing a letter to Professor Ferox, who was the only person he could think of who'd been in potential danger last night. Livia knew him. He'd attacked her once, and Remus thought she might seem like the sort of person to hold a grudge. Besides, writing him gave him something to distract himself from how dreadful he felt, aching and shivery all over. He knew he looked awful too, and thought it best to keep his head down. She doesn't know what she's talking about, Lily whispered to him on the way out of the hall. Miles just sees everything as black and white. Don't take it personally. I don't, Remus replied tiredly. I'm fine, don't worry about me. Still, he was dreading care of magical creatures later that morning, where he'd have to sit next to Marlene. He'd cast a glamour to cover up his newest scars and was sipping on a pepper-up potion as if it were keeping him alive, but he couldn't hide the fact that he was utterly exhausted, not to mention the bone-crushing guilt he felt over the attacks. He'd known they were going to happen. He'd told Dumbledore, but it hadn't been enough. He ought to have done more. Arithmancy wasn't too bad. He had Sirius, James and Lily in that, and they formed a protective huddle round him, taking their seats at the back of the class. The exercises were almost impossible to do. Remus found his mind oddly fractured, unable to hold down a thought for very long. James and Sirius fell into their usual clownish mischief, creating a satisfactory distraction any time the teacher glanced up at Remus. He was so grateful, especially as they'd both been up all night too. Afterwards, Sirius walked him to care of magical creatures as he had a free hour, and Remus hadn't the energy to refuse. The hallways were too busy for him to risk leaning on the other boy for support, so they just went slowly. Just bunk off, Sirius pleaded, watching him struggle down the third flight of stairs. "You've shown your face. Snivelus has seen you." Remus shook his head, carrying on doggedly. As he reached the bottom, a couple of third-year boys rushed past, shouting at each other and laughing. One of them bumped into Remus with his bag, which would have been nothing on a good day, but at that moment was exactly the wrong thing and knocked Remus sideways into the banister. He bit his lip as the left side of his body hit the hard stone, but couldn't help letting out a gasp of pain. "Certis Corpius!" Sirius yelled, pulling his wand out and firing the hex at all three boys. They yelped as the marble staircases turned to quicksand beneath them and began to swallow them up. Sirius only stopped it when their legs were dangling through the bottom and they were trapped halfway. "Watch what you're doing," he said menacingly, before helping Remus down the last few steps. No one intervened. No one ever did when it was Sirius, and Remus was too focused on getting to his lesson on time. "Promise me you'll go back and free them?" he asked as they neared the classroom. "I don't need you getting a detention on top of everything." "If someone else hasn't found them," Sirius shrugged. "I only taught them a lesson. Any prefect would have done the same." Remus would have usually found that funny, but he felt as though he was wading through quicksand too, his limbs heavy and slow, everything around him foggy and blurred. "Right," Sirius was saying. "I'll be back here in an hour to get you." "I don't need collecting, I'm not a child," Remus muttered. "No," Sirius squeezed his hand very quickly. "You're my Moony." He made a mental note to save that up for later, when he was alone, and could bask in the thought of being serious as anything. Just now he hated himself too much to allow anyone to be kind. Care of Magical Creatures was worse than he could have imagined. His temperature was running even higher from exertion, and he had to keep wiping sweat from his eyes, hair sticking to his forehead. Despite breakfast having only been an hour earlier, his stomach felt like an empty cavern, growling intermittently. His head ached and his vision swam, but he sat bolt upright, staring fixedly at the blackboard. They were supposed to be doing dragons, identifying the various species and their individual properties. Kettleburn began the lesson as he always did, with a terrifying and usually harrowing story of an encounter he'd had with whatever creature they were discovering. Today was no different, and the battle-scarred professor was in his element today. He'd lost 2 limbs to dragons. Despite this animated tale, only half the class was actually paying attention. You could tell by the look of faint horror on their faces as they scribbled down notes. The other half, Marlene and Mary included, was busy reading the chapter in their textbooks which concerned werewolves. "There's something a bit sexy about the whole beast man thing, though," Mary whispered across Remus, who began to feel light-headed. "Mary!" Marlene hissed angrily. "That's completely insensitive. People died." "I'm just saying." "You wouldn't think that way anyway if you met a real one. I spoke to Sian Bolsh over the summer. She left last year for healer training, and she's been shadowing a healer on the lycanthropy ward at St. Mungo's. They have awful hygiene, most of them, because they can't live near normal wizards, and they basically live off handouts and charity." "Well, then I feel sorry for them," Mary snapped back. "That sounds horrible. Wizards are so heartless." "You're being deliberately dense. They're not safe." "Excuse me, Professor Kettleburn." The whole class turned to see McGonagall standing in the doorway. Remus's stomach dropped. Had she come for him? Had the Ministry finally come for him? The head of Gryffindor House looked very grave and was holding a letter in her hand, but she did not look at Remus. "I'm sorry to interrupt. Marlene McKinnon, may I speak to you?" Marlene frowned and stood up, setting her quill back to the inkwell. She threw a confused glance back at Mary and Remus before following Professor McGonagall out of the room. The door closed and everyone stared at it in silence. "She can't be in trouble," Mary whispered to Remus. "She's too goody-goody." Remus mumbled something, but his hunger had turned into queasiness and he didn't want to open his mouth. He wished he could take off his cloak. The room was so stuffy and hot. He was getting uncomfortably damp under his armpits and across his back. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Mary asked, her face concerned. "You look like you're going to puke. Is it Kettleburn's horrible stories?" Remus nodded very slightly, shooting pains bursting up his neck as he did so. He rested his forehead in his hands, hoping he just looked like he was really interested in his notes. There was no room for Mary to probe him any more, though. A horrible shriek sounded outside the classroom, followed by a chilling moan of absolute despair. Mary was on her feet at once and flew out of the room to see her friend. Remus caught only a glimpse as the door swung open and shut, of Marlene on her knees, sobbing, and McGonagall bent over her, patting her shoulders. Even Kettleburn was rendered mute for a few moments, before regaining his composure and clearing his throat. "We're living in difficult times," he said, quite out of character. "I urge you all to be kind to each other, especially as you prepare to leave Hogwarts." The lesson continued after that, much subdued, and it took a lot of Remus's concentration to stay conscious in his seat, now that he was alone at his desk. About 15 minutes before class was due to end, there was a second knock on the door. "Enter!" Kettleburn barked. The door opened and Lily walked in. "Good morning, Professor. I've just come to collect Marlene's things for her." Kettleburn nodded and gestured at Marlene's desk where her work was still spread out, her book bag hanging off the back of her chair. Lily went over and quickly started gathering things together. She took one look at Remus and raised her head. "Sorry, Professor. Could I ask Remus to come with me? I didn't realize Mary left all her bits too." Of course, Kettleburn nodded distractedly, labelling a diagram of a dragon's lair on the board. "Chapters 18 to 25 for next lesson, please, Mr. Lupin." "Yes, sir," Remus croaked, picking up Mary's bag. Thank God it wasn't heavy, and thank God for Lily Evans. As soon as they were outside in the corridor, Remus leaned heavily against the wall and closed his eyes. "Oh, Remus," Lily said anxiously, raising a cool hand to his forehead. "You look dreadful." "I'm fine," he mumbled uselessly, eyes still shut. "Just give me a second. Is Marlene—" "She's gone home." Lily lowered her voice, though they were quite alone. "Her brother Danny was attacked last night. St. Mungo started realizing names." Remus's head swam. He opened his eyes only to see black spots and closed them again in case he fainted. "Is he—" "He's alive. But it doesn't sound very good." The guilt was overwhelming, roaring in Remus's ears. How could he ever look Marlene in the eye again? "Come on." Lily took his arm and draped it over her shoulders. She fitted very snugly, but he didn't dare lean on her too much. "I'm taking you to the tower. You're in no fit state for school. I'll say you're helping me pack for Marlene." "Someone ought to tell." He was about to say Yasmin, but realized it was still a secret. "Madame Pomfrey," he finished lamely. "Marlene's going to miss healing lessons." "I'm sure she already knows," Lily said briskly. "Come along now." She was a lot harder to refuse than Sirius. Chapter 133, 7th Year, Sunday Afternoon. Sunday, 29th January, 1978. "Moony?" It's after midday. So, thought you might fancy getting up?" "No, thanks." "Can I come in?" "No." "Okay, then." Sirius began to walk away, and Remus's stomach flipped. "I'm sorry," he said, loud enough for Sirius to hear and stop. Remus finally crawled out of the covers. "I do want you here. I just don't know what to say." He could hear Sirius fidgeting, his hands in his pockets, then running through his hair. Finally, "We don't have to talk?" Remus sighed. He was a mess. He hadn't washed properly since Wednesday, and had only got out of bed to use the bathroom. The other boys had been feeding him by passing food through the crack in his curtains. If they hadn't, Remus wasn't sure if he'd eaten at all. He was in the worst state he'd ever been in, but he missed Sirius. "Okay, then." The curtains parted, and Remus scowled against the bright daylight, but Sirius crawled in quickly, closing them again. He looked at Remus, but he didn't look too hard before shuffling down next to him and enveloping him in his arms. "Thanks," he breathed against Remus's hair, "for letting me in. Reckon I must stink." Sirius inhaled deeply, tickling Remus's forehead and making him squirm. "No, just smell like Moony." "Gear off, mutt." Remus wiggled away from him.
Feel like getting up soon? Everyone's worried, and they're looking at me now, like I know what to do, because everyone knows about us, which is weird. Quite a lot of pressure, really.
Remus chuckled, and it felt strange, but good. Still, he had a melancholic episode to maintain.
I still don't feel like getting up. Okay, then you need to let me hide here with you, because I'm not going back out there. Sirius? Remus!
Sirius frowned at him, exaggerating his eyebrows to look stupid.
Stop it.
Remus folded his arms, aware that he was starting to sound like a sulky child.
I will not. Sirius poked him in the ribs. Come on, I know you're really feeling shit about everything, but did you ever consider that it's not for you to hog all the misery like this? Maybe if you talk to your friends, it might not seem quite so bleak.
Remus frowned up at him, arms still crossed.
Maybe that works for you. Are you saying this is working for you?
Remus pressed his lips together. They stared at each other for a minute. Remus began to think he'd quite like to fight Sirius now, like they did on full moons, just because it was a fun way to expel energy. Then he noticed something. He sniffed the air.
Are you bleeding? I can smell blood. Probably you from the moon. No, I've healed already. I've never had any open wounds longer than a day. Bloody hell, Sirius laughed lightly. How is it possible for you to get any cooler? And it's your blood, I can tell. There you go again, you're basically a superhero. Sirius! Okay.
He sat up, running his hands through his hair.
You swiped at me a few times over the moon. I told you that. We did it to each other. You can't turn me when I'm a dog. We've tested that enough times. But you're still bleeding. It was almost a week ago. You need to go to Madame Pomfrey. Oh yeah, and say my werewolf boyfriend scratched me while I was in dog form as an illegal animagus. Jesus,
Remus groaned, hauling himself up and out of bed, grabbing Sirius by the wrist and pulling him along.
Where are we going? I need better light.
He yanked open the bathroom door and slammed down the lid of the toilet.
Sit,
he instructed. Sirius complied, half smiling. Remus opened the little mirror cabinet above the sink, digging out murtlap essence and disinfectant and gauze and cotton balls. He'd found over years of trial and error that a combination of magical and muggle things worked best, as with almost everything else. He pulled his wand out of his pyjama bottoms and stood in front of Sirius.
Okay, show me.
Sirius dropped his head, no longer enjoying Remus's newfound motivation. He sighed heavily and lifted his shirt, saying,
It's not that bad.
It wasn't as bad as Remus had feared, but it still made his stomach clench when he saw 3 dark red stripes across Sirius's ribs. They were starting to heal, but he knew he could fix it fairly easily. He took a deep breath, met Sirius's eye, and then reached for the disinfectant, then his wand. Remus was pretty good at healing cuts now, and the scab and the redness were gone in an instant. Now they were just white stripes.
I'm so sorry, he said mournfully. It was a magical wound. You'll have a scar there for the rest of your life now.
Remus looked down at the mark, then up again.
That's fine, Remus,
he said quietly. So Remus rejoined the group at Sirius's goading, and they were all kind enough to pretend he had merely been unwell and not avoiding them. The news over the past few days had been particularly grim. First, the Prophet had published a list of the dead and their photographs. Then they published a list of those presumed bitten, along with their photographs, which had provoked outcry among some of the more liberal commentators and ignited a debate on mandatory registration for all werewolves. Greyback's name had not been mentioned, nor any other werewolf that Remus was aware of. It was as if the horrific crime simply happened one night and the assailants had vanished into thin air. No one had heard from Marlene either, though Danny McKinnon was one of those named in the papers. He'd been given a full 4 inches of text by virtue of his celebrity as beater for the Chudley Cannons. The team's manager was interviewed and quoted saying that while he'd not yet been briefed on the details of Danny's condition, the Cannons operated a zero-tolerance policy to half-breeds and dangerous creatures and would deal with any allegations of infection accordingly. James vowed that he would never see a Chudley Cannons game again, but Remus mostly felt sorry for Danny. They tried to put all this misery behind them and went down for Sunday lunch, and thank goodness. It was generally Remus's favourite meal of the week, and he'd have been even more blue if he missed it. Then spent the rest of the evening cosied up in the common room in front of the fire. Remus even acquiesced to a chess game with Peter, who was thrilled.
"You know what we ought to start getting serious about?"
Sirius mused, sorting through his record collection.
"Any EWTs?"
Remus asked hopefully as Peter captured his knight.
Job applications?
Lily said from the armchair where she sat in James's lap, reading a magazine. The Quidditch Cup, James suggested.
"For goodness sake," Sirius tutted. "I'm ashamed to call you all Marauders."
What? All three of them frowned, offended. Peter chuckled. He's talking about the big prank on Slytherin. You know, we started planning it before Christmas.
"Wormy boy, you are without a doubt my very favourite person."
Sirius grinned broadly. Peter snorted. Bugger off, and promptly captured Remus's queen.
"Oh, I don't know why I bother. Haven't beaten you since I was 13.
Remus sighed, leaning back on the rug on his elbows. He looked up at Sirius.
"Well then, got a plan?" "Maybe. Whatever we do, I think we should focus the attack on the dungeons."
Let's not throw words around like attack, Lily said hurriedly. This is just a practical joke, right? In the wholesome spirit of harmless house rivalry?
"If you like,"
Sirius shrugged, half ignoring the interjection.
"Anyway, Moony, I thought your study group was in on this. What's the point in having all these minions if you can't make them work for you?" "Oh my god, for the last time, they aren't my minions." Remus rolled his eyes. "Anyway, we've not got a proper study group yet this term. I've been ever so slightly busy." "Well, as none of us are scheduled to be in mortal peril for the next month or so," Sirius replied, "I think we ought to get cracking. Everyone could do with a laugh, eh? Assemble the troops. We'll meet sometime next week."
As long as it doesn't clash with Quidditch, James yawned. I'm there. Right, I'm off to bed. Transfiguration first thing. The others all glanced up at the clock or began to yawn themselves and agreed to follow suit. The common room was clearing out now anyway, and they were some of the last to leave. Remus had just got his pyjamas on and brushed his teeth when he remembered that he'd left his book downstairs. While this didn't usually matter, this particular book was Maurice by E.M. Forster, and though the cover was nondescript, he was a bit concerned that if someone picked it up and read the blurb, there would be some raised eyebrows. Sighing, he left the bathroom and hurried downstairs, muttering, "Getting my book," to Sirius, who was next in the queue. He'd just grabbed the book and was about to head back up when he heard the portrait hole slide open. He turned to see Mary enter. She was wearing a short, spangly silver dress, and she tripped on her way in, but caught herself and giggled. "All right," he called to her. She looked up, squinting a bit in the dim light. "Hi, sexy," she grinned, wandering in a bit unsteady on her feet. Might have been 4-inch heels she was wearing, or it might have been the witch's brew Remus could smell wafting off of her. "Hello, been somewhere?" He walked back across the couches, wanting to make sure she was all right before leaving. "Phew." She waved a hand, collapsing into the nearest armchair, spreading her legs out. Her short dress rode up her thighs, but she didn't seem bothered. "Just a few drinks in the Ravenclaw common room." "Thought you were seeing a Hufflepuff." He was there." She exhaled, smiling, tilting her head back and closed her eyes. The lids were painted gold, finely rimmed with kohl. She looked like an Egyptian queen in a party frock. "But a lot of people were there, I suppose." She sounded sad. Remus sat down in the armchair opposite her, clutching the book in his lap. "Are you okay, Mary?" "Oh, fine." She opened her eyes slowly and smiled at him. She wasn't that drunk, he realized, but she looked tired and deeply unhappy. "Just stuff on my mind. Boys being wankers. Poor Marlene." "Have you heard from her?" Mary shook her head, then sat up, blinking. "Haven't got a fag, have you, sweetheart? I don't usually, but I just really fancy one." "Yeah." Remus reached in his pockets for his matchbox where he kept the cigarettes he'd rolled himself. He slid it open. "Normal or fun?" "Oh, fun, please," she purred, reaching over. "Might help me sleep." About Marlene," Remus said, lighting his own. "I just had a thought. You know her friend Yaz? Have you seen her about? I wasn't sure if anyone told her." "I did," Mary said, exhaling, watching Remus through the smoke beneath her heavy golden eyes. "I told her." "Oh!"
Remus blinked, surprised.
That's good then.
I thought she had better know, Mary mused, pulling a strand of her hair and winding it coyly round her finger. Didn't want her to think Miles had gone cold on her. Remus took a quick, sharp puff on his cigarette, frowning very slightly.
What do you mean?
Mary laughed, arching back in the chair, showing her pearly white teeth. She let the curl of hair spring back into place like a corkscrew. Oh, come on, Remus. She shook her head. I know.
She told you?
No, Mary conceded, settling down with a sigh. But I'm not thick, despite rumours to the contrary. At least I know what romance looks like. She arched her eyebrow. I'm not as dense as James, for example. How long did he take to figure it out?
He doesn't know about Marlene, Remus replied. They must keep it quiet during Quidditch stuff.
I'm not talking about Marlene now. Talking about you.
Me?
He's a good kisser, isn't he? She winked at him. But then, you were too, I seem to remember.
How?
I've suspected for a little while now. Just little things. All the time you two spend together. Him being single for more than 5 minutes. Wasn't 100% sure, but you've just confirmed it for me.
Bugger.
She laughed again, a friendly, trilling sound. Silly boy. She smiled affectionately, playing with her hair again as she smoked. She looked at him again, her eyes more focused. When she spoke, her voice was more serious than usual. It's fine if you want to keep it quiet. I was going to wait to see if you told me yourself, like I'm doing with Miles. But I just want to let you know. I know I've got this reputation for being a bit of a big mouth, but I can keep a secret, okay? Especially for my friends. And she bit her lip. If there's anything else you're going to keep secret, Remus, then you can trust me, okay? It doesn't change anything. There was almost too many revelations for one evening. Remus sucked hard on his cigarette and half wished he'd opted for a spliff too.
What are you saying? He asked very carefully. Do you think you know something else?
Remus, she sat up. The scars, being ill every full moon. We do the same care of magical creatures class.
You can't tell anyone,
Remus said, his voice very low, even though they were completely alone.
Please, Mary. Me and Sirius, that's one thing, but this? I could get kicked out of school. I could be arrested.
Hey! Mary stood up quickly and came over to sit on the arm of the chair. I'm not going to tell. That's what I'm trying to explain. She wound an arm round his shoulder. Makes no difference to me. I swear.
Really?
Honestly. She kissed his cheek and gave him a squeeze. So don't take what happened to Marlene's brother so hard, huh? It's got nothing to do with you.
She'd never forgive me if she knew,
Remus said sadly. Mary handed him what was left of the joint and he puffed on it gratefully. Don't worry about that, she said flippantly. She'll come round. She knows who you really are. And maybe you could help. You could write to Danny even. I bet he could do with a friend. That's... Remus was about to say that while it was a really nice idea, it was almost impossible, considering the fact that he was unregistered, and it would be a bad idea to draw attention to himself.
Moony, where are you?
Sirius's plaintive voice came clattering down the stairs.
I can smell the pot all the way from here. You're not being subtle. Oh, hiya, MacDonald.
Black, Mary nodded, still perched on the arm of Remus's chair. Sorry, I'm trying to seduce your boyfriend.
Oh, yeah, I'd like to see you... Wait, what? My what?
She just poked out her tongue at him. He looked at Remus.
Are we just telling everyone now?
Oi! Mary hopped off the seat. I'm not everyone, arrogant tosser. Don't forget, I had you both first. Remus couldn't help laughing at the look on Sirius's face, and got out of the chair sheepishly, still clutching Maurice.
Sorry, I'll come up now. We were just chatting.
He looked back at Mary.
Will you be okay?
Fine, she nodded, smiling. I'm off to bed too. Night, lads.
Good night.
Back upstairs in the warm glow of their dorm room, Peter was already snoring softly behind his curtains, and James was sitting cross-legged on his bed, flipping through his Quidditch notebook.
Thought we lost you, Moony,
he whispered cheerily as the two boys entered.
Bumped into Mary. She's been at some party with the Ravenclaws. And see, this is what happens when you get stuck with the head boy and the head girl in your house,
Sirius sighed, leaning back on his own bed.
All the fun happens elsewhere.
Oh, stop whinging, James grinned, closing his book. We'll have more parties and you know it. Now go to bed like a good boy.
Fine,
Sirius yawned, falling backwards dramatically so that he disappeared through the heavy velvet hangings.
Good night, then,
Remus started, making for his own bed, but Sirius's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist.
Moony,
he whispered softly from the shadows behind the veil. Remus bit his lip and glanced over at James, who looked away awkwardly and began to draw his own bed curtains across. Oh well, fuck it.
Okay.
Remus let Sirius pull him inside. Chapter 134. 7th Year. Valentine's Day, 1978. Monday, 13th of February, 1978.
You know, Lily yawned, other boyfriends might take the night before Valentine's Day to plan something nice for their girlfriends rather than an assault on other students.
Thought we were calling it a practical joke, Evans, Sirius winked. Anyway, how do you know what other boys are doing? We're the only boys you know, and we're doing this.
Touché.
Lily poked her tongue out at him from where she sat cross-legged on James's bed. And, James said, sitting on the floor beside Remus, folding envelopes as fast as Sirius could stuff them, how do you know I haven't already planned something nice?
When do you have the time? She shrugged. Whenever you're not with me, you're playing Quidditch.
I can multitask, he said haughtily, a mischievous twinkle in his eye. Remus gave James a sideways glance. He couldn't account for any of James's free time either, but it was best never to underestimate James Potter. How about you, Pete? Mary asked, sitting on James's other side, neatly stacking the envelopes he handed for her and ticking the names off the list.
Big plans tomorrow?
No, Peter replied glumly. He was sitting on his stomach on his bed, frantically completing the charms notes due for the next day. He dropped a few hints to Remus about copying them, but Remus had pretended not to understand, and eventually poor Wormtail had dropped it and just resigned himself to doing a poor job.
What about Dorcas? Mary pressed.
Dumped me.
Oh, poor love, she cooed. At least I won't be the only single one.
Really? Peter looked up, hopefully.
Yeah, dumped that stupid Hufflepuff. Mary nodded, bent over her work.
Oh, well, if you fancied dinner, maybe, Peter started. Mary shook her head.
Oh no, sorry, Pete. I'm triple booked as it is. It'll be a miracle if none of them bump into each other.
Oh, Peter returned to his homework, looking even more depressed than before. Lily stifled a giggle, but Mary seemed oblivious.
Cheer up, Pete, we still love you,
Remus offered, stuffing his very last envelope and handing it to James.
Me and Padfoot will have dinner with you. So basically, exactly the same as every other night of the year, Sirius teased.
You two not doing anything then? Mary asked casually. It felt like a loaded question all the same, and Remus found it hard to ignore the glances his friends were now shooting at each other. He looked up at Sirius and said very firmly,
Don't even think about it.
Sirius's face cracked into a smile.
I think Valentine's Day is Moony's idea of hell.
Exactly, Remus nodded solemnly. Let the girls have flowers and hearts. He had plenty else going on, thank you very much.
Oh, I think that's a shame,
Mary said, crossing the last name off her list and stretching her legs out on the rug, lying back on her elbows.
Valentine's Day can be nice if you do it right.
Remus smirked at her. Doing it right to Mary meant receiving votive offerings from her various acolytes, a fantasy in which she was Aphrodite and all would pay homage.
Nope, not interested,
he said, stretching his own stiff legs.
Sirius likes it, Mary said slyly. He was always dead romantic.
When we weren't fighting,
Sirius interjected. Remus looked at him and realized he'd never actually considered whether or not the other boy was interested in celebrating the day. He just assumed they were on the same page. Anyway, that was different, Peter mused, sucking the nib of his quill and getting ink on his lip. What was? Mary asked. When Padfoot was going out with you, Peter replied. Obviously he did all the mushy stuff then. Obviously? Lily spoke up. Remus cringed. He could see where this was going. The redhead had her hackles up. It didn't happen often, but when it did, it always ended in a scolding. What do you mean, Peter? Peter saw it coming too, but bless him, he tried to explain himself. I wasn't being nasty, he said. It's just, well, it's not the same thing, is it? Yes, it is, Mary frowned. James was clearly annoyed too. Remus sighed inwardly. He looked up at Sirius, who shrugged at him. Remus held out his hand, and Sirius hopped off the bed to take it, pulling Remus to his feet. Remus cleared his throat. If you've all finished discussing your relationship amongst yourselves... They all looked up sheepishly. Sorry, Moony. Sorry, Remus. Let's move on, shall we? Remus raised an eyebrow and leaned against his bedpost with his hands in his pockets. He nodded at the pile of sealed envelopes. We need to pass those round tomorrow as soon as. I think probably best to do it at breakfast so it gets mixed in with the regular post and doesn't look suspicious. This was met with a murmur of general agreement. Don't forget the ink only becomes legible when the right person gives their name, Remus continued. He went over to his bedside table for his matchbox of cigarettes and slid one out. This was such a good idea. I can't believe you did it so quickly, Mary said. She didn't know that the spell they used was exactly the same as the one on the Marauders map, and they weren't going to tell her. You are in the presence of greatness, MacDonald, Sirius said, taking Remus's cigarette the second he'd lit it. Remus sighed and pulled out another. At least open a window if you're going to have a smoke in here, James sighed. We have to smoke in here, Sirius said, flicking his wand at the windows so they flung wide open. Because our poxy head boy banned smoking in the common room. All the prefects voted on that, actually, Lily said wryly. See, Moony? Sirius nudged him with his hip. This is why you should have stayed a prefect. You could have been the voice of dissent. Truly tragic, Remus exhaled smoke. Right, I'm off to bed then, Mary said, getting up, lifting the pile of invitations and setting them down on James's trunk. I'm looking forward to this. Be nice to have something else to think about. I'll come with you, Lily said, getting up too. Shall I walk you back? James leapt to his feet. Both girls giggled as if he'd said something charming rather than ridiculous. I'll keep us safe in the arduous journey across the common room, Potter, Mary teased. Still, Lily and James spent much of the next 5 minutes bidding each other goodbye, which involved a lot of snogging. When Mary finally managed to drag her friend away, Lily was pink and grinning. Love you, she called on her way down the stairs. Love you too, James called back. Sirius began to make sick noises, which made Peter start laughing, but Remus just watched James's dopey expression. He hadn't heard them say I love you before. He didn't think he'd ever heard anyone say it, actually, not anyone he cared about anyway. He'd seen it written down, in books and in the letter from Hope, but neither of those things had felt as tangible as this. How long had they been saying that? As long as they'd been feeling it? Was it hard to say the first time? Remus thought it must be, like casting a Patronus. He finished his cigarette in a contemplative mood while the others moved round him, finishing homework and changing for bed. He supposed he could ask Sirius about the whole love thing, but he wasn't sure he wanted to open that can of worms. They were happy as they were, weren't they? It was just getting comfortable now that their friends knew. Plus, after 2 years of pining and almost a year of secrecy, Remus just wanted to enjoy what they had, without all of the prescriptive stuff hanging about them. Remus knew from experience that it was best to resist the temptation to pick things like that apart, especially something as precious and hard-won as he and Sirius had. The problem was, once you started, you might never remember how it worked in the first place. He brushed his teeth, still thinking, and wandered toward Sirius's bed to sit and wait for him. Finished! Peter cried, raising his quill with a flourish. Finally! Well done, Pete, James yawned, climbing into bed. I didn't get to help you lot, though, Peter said, looking at the pile of envelopes wistfully. That's okay, this is only preliminary work, Remus offered. The real planning starts on Wednesday. Exactly, James said encouragingly. Anyway, don't feel bad. Padfoot didn't help either. Oi! Sirius came out of the bathroom at that moment. I wrote the damn things. Where would you lot be without my beautiful penmanship? And I don't recall Mrs. Prongs doing anything either. He'd taken to calling Lily this in private. He wouldn't dare to her face, with the full knowledge that it annoyed James. The messy-haired boy just rolled over in bed, flicking his middle finger in Sirius's direction. Sirius chuckled and got into his own bed. Remus got in too, still deep in thought.
"Night, lads,"
Sirius called, drawing the curtains shut. "Night," Peter and James echoed back. In the dark, Sirius held Remus's hand and they smiled at each other sleepily.
"You're very quiet,"
Sirius whispered.
"Everything okay?"
"Yeah," Remus whispered back.
"Just thinking. Prank stuff." "Good." "Sirius?" "Remus?" "You know Valentine's Day?" "Heard of it." "Do you want to, what Mary said?" "I knew that would get you wound up. I could practically see your brain starting to overheat." "Piss off."
Remus kicked his shin.
"I'm just asking." "Mary loved all that stuff. Presents and flowers and cards and shit. I liked doing it for her because it made her happy. You'd hate it, so I won't." "It's just so public,"
Remus said.
"I know, don't worry about it." "Okay." "Remus." "What?" "Stop worrying." Fine, I believe you. Anyway, it's not a real thing,"
Sirius said thoughtfully.
"Valentine's Day. I looked it up." "It's real to muggles, isn't it?"
Remus frowned. He couldn't say he'd given it much thought.
"There was a bloke called Valentine, but there's nothing romantic about it. But I did find some other stuff about the Romans." "Why can't you apply this thirst for knowledge to your actual schoolwork?" "Oh, don't be so boring. Anyway, have you ever heard of the Lupercalia?"
Remus felt a sinking feeling in his stomach and let go of Sirius's hand.
"I don't want to talk about wolf stuff right now." "You have heard of it?"
Sirius sounded pleased.
"No, I just know it's Latin for wolf because it's my bloody name." "Oh, right. It's not what you think. It's a festival." "Okay. And it's really cool. There are blood sacrifices and running around naked and—" "I'm going to sleep." "But you like history."
"Shut up, Padfoot, he wants to go to sleep," James shouted from across the room. "And so do I." "Yeah," Peter echoed.
"Mind your business,"
Sirius shouted back.
"Sonoro quiesis,"
Remus muttered, creating a dry bubble of silence inside the bed. He still whispered when he spoke, though, because it was weird to talk in a normal volume in the dark.
"I said I didn't want to talk about the wolf stuff. God. I was only trying to make you feel better about Valentine's Day." "I didn't feel badly about it in the first place." "Okay, sorry I misread you."
Sirius was whispering too, but loudly, obviously annoyed.
"You were all quiet about it and I wanted to cheer you up. I thought you were jealous about Lily and James." "Jealous?" "That's the wrong word. You were just... I saw you watching them, kissing and stuff and being all mushy. And I know you hate public displays of affection, but I don't know. It's not like we have a choice either way."
Remus blinked in the dark, rolling back over to see Sirius's face.
"It bothers you, doesn't it?"
It had to, because it had never bothered Remus before. Suddenly, he realized what it had all been about.
"A bit, maybe,"
Sirius replied honestly. Remus fumbled under the duvet for his hand again. Tuesday, 14th of February, 1978. The next morning, James and Sirius were nowhere to be found. Remus presumed they'd left early for Quidditch practice. It was a bright sunny day, despite a chill in the air. After a few minutes of deep thought, Remus rifled in his bedside drawer for his very last chocolate frog and bunged it in his pocket before heading downstairs. The rest of the Gryffindors woke to find that in the night the house elves had decorated their common room with garlands of red and pink-purple paper hearts, something which seemed to divide all of the students. "Hardly appropriate in a school," Christopher mumbled, meeting Remus and Mary on their way out of the portrait hole. "I think it's lovely," Mary sighed cheerily. She was subtly dressed for the occasion, wearing a red ribbon in her hair and red enamel studs in each earlobe. Christopher shook his head grimly at her. "If it were a proper holiday, like Christmas or Easter or something—"
"But why do wizards celebrate those things?"
Remus cut in thoughtfully as they progressed toward the dining hall. Every corridor was also decked out in pink and red crepe paper, and there seemed to be music coming from somewhere.
None of the purebloods I've met are Christians or even know anything about Jesus or the Easter Bunny or...
The Easter what? Christopher was staring at him as if he were mad.
Don't bother, Remus, Mary laughed. Lily and I tried back in first year. We're not supposed to ask.
Christopher's mood did not improve as they entered the great hall, which was bathed in a rosy pink glow by a collection of candles floating inside red glass lanterns. Fresh flowers had been placed in vases on every table, and pink envelopes flew back and forth over the heads of the students, Valentine's cards looking for their recipients.
"Oh, for goodness sake,"
Christopher muttered, taking his seat and pouring himself a very black coffee.
"It's only one day," Remus said, lifting the teapot, which was also pink.
No sooner had they sat down than a pile of pink envelopes fluttered into Mary's lap, making her squeal with delight. Remus grinned too. He pulled out his own envelopes and whispered an incantation, tossing them into the air so that they mingled with the others flying above them.
"Here you go, Chris."
Remus tossed one across the table.
"It's not a valentine, I promise."
"Oh, what is it?" Christopher held the blank envelope warily.
"An invitation," Remus winked. "Give it your name, but don't share it, okay?"
Okay."
"Morning!"
Lily appeared, looking cheerful as usual, clutching a book on advanced potions.
"Anyone seen Potter?"
"Quidditch pitch?" Remus raised his head.
"No,"
Lily shrugged.
"I thought so too, but Ravenclaw booked it this morning."
"He and Padfoot were gone when I woke up," Remus said.
"That's exactly what I was afraid of,"
Lily replied, taking her seat.
No sooner had she sugared her porridge than a loud pop echoed over their heads, and everyone looked up. Those students who hadn't immediately dived for cover beneath their breakfast tables began oohing and ahhing as a rather spectacular fireworks display began over their heads. The burst of colour took the form of gigantic glittering love hearts, and the embers which rained down turned out to be pink and white flower heads.
"Lilies!"
Mary said gleefully as one settled on her pile of cards.
"Oh no!"
Christopher wailed.
"I'm allergic!"
He sneezed before aiming his wand upwards and gasping,
"Protego!"
to defend himself against the fluttering blooms.
"I don't believe this."
Lily was blushing harder than Remus had ever seen her. He grinned.
"You were asking for it, I'm afraid."
"I'd have been happy with a card,"
she hissed as the final fireworks died out and the last of the lilies sailed to the floor like great pink snowflakes, filling the room with their lovely scent.
"Oh, shut up, Evans,"
Mary tutted.
"It's bloody gorgeous of him."
"Cheers, MacDonald." James appeared at Lily's shoulder with Sirius.
"You utter idiot."
Lily stood up and wound her arms round James's neck, kissing him. Remus wasn't watching this display, though. He was watching Sirius, who flicked his wand behind James's back. The flowers which had gathered on the table, those which Chris had not tried to clear anyway, began to move again and gathered together in front of Lily's plate. With another soft little pop, the pile transformed into a large box emblazoned with even more lilies.
"What's that?"
Lily turned, leaning over to get a closer look.
"Open it and see."
James was grinning ear to ear, clearly chuffed with himself. Christopher sneezed again and blew his nose, but was roundly ignored as Mary and Remus stood up to get a better look. Lily, still pink and smiling, carefully lifted the lid of the box and everyone leaned in. On a red velvet pillow, with a bow round its neck, was a tiny little charcoal grey kitten with huge yellow eyes.
"Oh!"
Lily gasped, reaching immediately to pick up the mewing creature and cuddle it close.
"Really, Potter? You got me a cat? I love him. Or her?"
"Him," James nodded. "I know your old family one died last Christmas, and Hagrid told me a litter was born in the village last week, so—"
"Oh, he's so sweet."
Mary reached over to stroke the kitten's head.
"Oh, for Merlin's sake!"
Christopher stood up, clutching his handkerchief to his nose.
"I'm allergic to cats too. Bloody stupid day."
With that, he got up and stormed away further up the table.
"Such a shame,"
Sirius smirked, taking his empty seat.
"Morning, Moony."
"Morning, Padfoot." Remus smiled. The rest of breakfast was spent cooing over Lily's new kitten and trying to choose a name. Remus kept a polite distance just in case. He had bad experiences with cats in the past and didn't fancy any new scratches today, no matter how tiny its claws were. Soon everyone was getting up to go to their various lessons, while arguing over who ought to look after the kitten that morning, and Sirius fell into step with Remus.
"Walk you to history?" he offered. "Oh, I don't need to go," Remus replied slyly. "It's drop-in lesson for any WTs." "But you always go to your lessons," Sirius replied. "Even the optional ones." "I know, but you're always telling me to relax, so—"
Remus covertly pulled his little matchbox out of his robe pocket and tapped it. Sirius raised an eyebrow.
"As much as I really love stoned Moony, what's brought on this rebelliousness?"
"Does there have to be a reason?" Remus shrugged. He glanced round quickly to check that no one was listening too intently, but they were all pretty absorbed in their various gifts and cards. He slipped the chocolate frog into Sirius's pocket.
"Happy Valentine's Day, wanker."
He'd never seen Sirius Black blush like that. Chapter 135, 7th Year, The Marauders Inter-House Prank Planning Cooperative. Wednesday, 15th of February, 1978. "I can't believe you're holding this thing here," Christopher said agitatedly as Remus unlocked the charms classroom.
"Best way to avoid detention. Flitwick's always let me use it," Remus replied.
"Exactly, it's so brazen," Christopher chided as they entered. "Brazen is our middle name," James declared excitedly, following them.
"Your middle name is Fleamont, you prat," Sirius scoffed. "And this place is genius. No one will ever suspect anything. I knew your SWAT lessons would come in useful one day, Moony."
"A lot of people find Remus's study group very helpful, actually," Christopher said primly, folding his arms and leaning against the wall.
"Oh, Chris, he's just teasing,"
Remus chuckled, setting his book bag down. He glanced at his pocket watch.
"We're all nice and early, James. Have you got an agenda?"
"A what?" James turned round from the blackboard, where he was directing the chalk to draw a gigantic lion with "Gryffindor rules, okay?" beneath it.
"Never mind,"
Remus sighed. "So, who else got an invitation?" Chris asked over the top of his book, which seemed to have materialized from nowhere. Christopher was the only other person Remus knew who could go from 0 to reading in less than 3 seconds flat.
"About 20 or 30 people, maybe," Remus said. "Anyone who expressed an interest before Christmas who seemed trustworthy."
"It was an extremely rigorous vetting process, actually," James said, now standing on Flitwick's desk and trying to touch the ceiling with his fingertips.
"Yeah, we almost didn't let Wormtail in,"
Sirius barked with laughter from the window, where he was leaning half out of it, smoking. Remus dearly wanted to go over there and wrap his arms round Sirius, steal the cigarette, which was probably one of his anyway, the thief, and kiss his neck. But the others would be arriving soon, and it was a completely mental line of thinking that. "Why do you call Peter that?" Christopher asked. "Just a nickname," they all said in unison. Peter arrived shortly after that, followed in by Mary, Lily, and Yasmin. Next were the 6th and 7th years from Remus's study group, and Dorcas, who was still apparently on friendly terms with Peter. Mary's latest squeeze, a Ravenclaw boy named Jonty Simmons, who looked like he couldn't believe his luck. And finally, much to Remus's distaste, Emmeline Vance sauntered in, 2 minutes late, with Roman Rotherhide. The room was pretty crowded after that and noisy with the buzz of excitement. Most of the group had some idea why they were there, but others were curious, and all of them were fascinated by the Marauders. James and Sirius adored the attention, of course, and immediately took centre stage. "Now we all know why we're here," James started, using his Quidditch captain voice. Immediately, Emmeline Vance's arm shot up. "Sorry, but I don't." Remus gave an impatient snort, and Christopher, sitting next to him, shot him a strange look. "Nor do I." Dorcas raised her hand too, along with 1 or 2 6-years from Remus's study group.
"Why did you all come then?"
Sirius asked, eyebrows raised. A group of girls sitting at the back of the room giggled. Remus made a mental note. He'd tried to avoid inviting too many members of the Sirius Black fan club, but it was pretty much unavoidable when that applied to half the school. "We're here to plan an organised protest, Christopher said, blushing a bit because he wasn't used to speaking in front of lots of people. Against Slytherin. Yeah, another 6-year shouted. I heard you lot were planning your biggest prank yet. I heard one of you knows how to get the monster out of the Chamber of Secrets. I heard you was planning to blow up the dungeons, one Hufflepuff boy squeaked. Whoa, whoa, whoa! James held up his hands. Bit less dramatic than that. Well, if it's about giving the Slytherins back for all the nonsense they've pulled, I'm in, Emmeline said decisively, tossing her luxuriant blonde curls. Remus tutted loudly, and Chris shot him another look. That's exactly what it's about, and that's exactly why we need you to keep quiet, James said, getting into his flow now. This is our last year, and we're inviting all of you to help us plan our final prank. Does that make us Marauders? The Hufflepuff boy squeaked again. There was an excited murmur. No, Peter said indignantly, though no one really paid him any attention. I'd like to think of it more as a collaboration, James said thoughtfully. An inter-house cooperative, Sirius added. Everyone seemed pretty pleased with that. At least it sounded impressive and official enough. Right, James clapped his hands together and rubbed them, smiling round at everyone. Now that's out of the way, who's got some ideas? 20 hands shot up. Lily spoke up. I think before we get into that, it might be good to have some ground rules. Like what? Sirius folded his arms grumpily. Like not actually hurting anyone. This is just fun, okay? Not revenge for everything Slytherin's ever done. She was using her head girl voice now, and a few people lowered their hands. Fair enough, James said, holding up his hands amicably, coming between Sirius and Lily. No physical harm intended. And as I said before, no talking about it outside of this room, on pain of death. Joking, Evans. He ducked as she went to slap the back of his head. After these initial teething problems, everyone seemed to enter into the spirit of the thing. Lots of people had ideas, from the extreme, Lily vetoed summoning a banshee to haunt the dungeons, to the subtle, Emmeline knew of a spell which would transfigure everyone's right shoe into a left shoe. She said she'd done it to her sister over the summer, and it had taken her 3 days to realise that it had been bothering her. Eventually, time ran short, so James set everyone homework, requiring them to come back next week with an idea. Then we can decide on the best one, Sirius declared. Who decides? Mary narrowed her eyes. Me, James, Pete and Moony, obviously. Sirius raised his chin. Can't we vote? One of the 6 years asked. Yeah, that seems fairer, Mary nodded. If we're all putting ourselves at risk of expulsion for you. Expulsion? Christopher bit his lip. Surely not. Surely we won't go that far. Will we get in trouble, though? The Hufflepuff boy raised his hand again. Everyone looked at him. Not much, Sirius shrugged. Bit of detention never hurt anyone. No, sorry, I don't mean detention. The boy shook his head nervously. I mean with, the Slytherins. They won't tell the Death Eaters to get us, will they? Sirius looked about to laugh when he realised that the atmosphere in the room had changed. A few people looked very awkward. Some of them were whispering amongst themselves. Remus could even smell a whiff of real fear creeping into the room. Everybody seemed to have tensed up a bit. Of course, Sirius and James did not worry about that sort of thing. This was all a part of the crusade of chaos they'd been on since they were 11. Even Remus had been pretty flippant about the magnitude of the prank, but he now saw that it meant a lot more to those gathered in the room. James, Sirius and Peter were the only purebloods in attendance, unless you counted Christopher, who had his own axe to grind with the Slytherins. James stood up again, pushing off Flitwick's desk and drawing himself up to full height. Absolutely not. No one in this room is getting hurt because of this prank. A few people relaxed. After all, James Potter, heir to the sleek-easy fortune, head boy, Quidditch captain, and leading mischief-maker, was somebody that most people trusted. Remus believed him wholeheartedly. Even if the issue had not been raised, it would have been a point of honour for James to protect anyone smaller than him. Lily was beaming at him too, and Sirius looked very pleased, as if that had settled everything. Right, Lily clapped her hands together now, taking the floor again. See you all next week, I suppose. I think we'd all better leave in smaller groups. Don't want to draw attention to ourselves. With that, the room slowly returned to normal, groups of students now chattering excitedly about ideas they had, or curses they'd like to try out. Lily assumed her head girl voice and started directing people out of the room in groups of 3 or 4 at short intervals. The Marauders turned inward to confer.
Bloody hell, James muttered so that he wouldn't be overheard. That was intense.
What did you expect? Mary tutted, hoisting herself up onto the desk and swinging her legs. This isn't a game to everyone. Some people are out for revenge.
Then that's what we'll give them,
Sirius said fiercely. He had that brightness in his eyes that told Remus he would be utterly unbearable for the next few hours. A plan was afoot, and nothing could bring Sirius down from that kind of excitement. Calm down, Black, Mary teased. You're school kids, not generals.
For now,
he replied darkly. Okay, you lot. Lily turned back into the room. It was only the 7 of them left. We'll go back in 2 groups, because no one is going to believe you 4 weren't up to something. Mary, James, Lily and Peter left first, with instructions for Remus, Sirius and Christopher to give them a 10-minute head start. Remus was a bit reluctant about this, but there was no way to bring it up. He couldn't help remembering what had happened the last time he and Christopher were alone in that classroom with Sirius. Though, of course, Christopher hadn't known Sirius was there at the time, and nor would Remus ever tell him. They tidied up the desks, cleared the chalkboard of James's lion, then stood about awkwardly for a minute.
Let's play Truth or Dare,
Sirius grinned. Why? Remus sighed, leaning on the desk. Here we go.
Pass the time. Or we could just have a normal conversation. Christopher wants to, don't you, Christopher? Great, you can go first. Truth or Dare, what do you fancy?
Chris's eyes flickered between Remus and Sirius nervously. I don't, truth?
Excellent. Start off easy as it's your first time playing.
Sirius nodded encouragingly.
Let's see. All right. Why did you want to get involved with the prank?
What?
You know, how come you came today? Chris has been involved since the beginning, Padfoot. You know that,
Remus tutted.
Right. So what made you get involved in the first place, then?
If you have to know, Christopher said rather icily, it was your brother. Sirius, to his credit, did not flinch.
Fair enough, he's a right little prick,
he nodded. He licked his lips and glanced at Remus, then back at Chris.
Sure there was no other reason?
No.
I'll go next, Remus said quickly. Chris, you can ask me to do a dare.
He never picked truth. It was far too dangerous. Chris bit his lip, still a bit thrown by this whole thing. Oh, I don't know. I'm crap at this sort of thing.
I've got a good one,
Sirius said at once. He winked at Remus, then leaned over and whispered in Chris's ear. Christopher's eyes widened and he laughed, covering his mouth. Okay, Remus. Chris was still blushing, but he was having fun now. Okay, you have to write something rude on the blackboard and leave it there.
I gave you specifics,
Sirius complained. I'm not saying that out loud, Christopher laughed, turning even redder. Remus could easily guess the tone of Sirius's suggestion. He raised an eyebrow wryly, as if under duress.
Okay, fine, I'll do it.
He went up to the blackboard and picked up some chalk. He considered it for a moment.
How rude?
He asked the other 2 casually. Very, Christopher said, smirking shyly.
Well, it's the rules of the game, I suppose.
Remus began to draw, enjoying the sniggering over his shoulder as he deftly traced out the first rude thing that popped into his head. He stepped back, an artist admiring his work. The other boys stood beside him, grinning madly. Well? Sirius slapped him on the back.
Moony, my old pal, that is the biggest knob I've ever seen.
Well, that's a relief, Remus smirked, forgetting Christopher was there. He didn't seem to notice, or else just assumed that it was Marauder humour, which it sort of was. Glorious, the younger boy nodded, still very pink about the cheeks.
Come on then,
Remus set down the chalk.
That's enough of a gap, we can go now. Common room? Oh, I haven't had my turn yet,
Sirius folded his arms.
What's the point?
Remus shook his head.
You're always going to choose dare, and there's nothing I could think of that you would even think twice about doing. Are you saying I'm the bravest? Stupidest, maybe,
Remus teased, elbowing him in the ribs.
Come on, let's go.
They left the classroom and set off through the quiet hallways back to Gryffindor Tower. It was fairly late in the evening now, and curfew was only a couple of hours off, so they were alone most of the way, other than the portraits, who were enjoying the peace and quiet. "Did you finish Maurice, Remus?" Chris asked. Always back to books.
"Nearly,"
Remus replied.
"Just a chapter or two to go. Do you promise me it's an happy ending?"
"Definitely," Christopher nodded. "You'll love it. I was thinking, if you're free on Saturday, we could have a chat about it in the Three Broomsticks. I'd really like to know what you think."
"Yeah, maybe."
Remus was torn between his desire not to disappoint Christopher, which he always seemed to be doing, and his keen awareness of Sirius's very mercurial mood.
"Don't see why not." "Is that the Muggle book you've been reading?"
Sirius asked.
"Is it good then?"
"Yeah, quite good," Remus nodded cautiously.
"Great, maybe I'll get it read then. I can get it done by Saturday. I read faster than you." "You do not,"
Remus scowled, scandalized.
"Well, I have more time to read anyway." "Only because you hardly go to half your lessons,"
Remus shot back. "I doubt it's your sort of thing, Sirius," Christopher spoke up. They both looked at him. He shrugged. "Well, it's not. Tell him what it's about, Remus." But it was too late. Sirius was already rummaging in the book bag at Remus's hip as they walked, and at once withdrew the text. Remus fought the urge to snatch it back, only because he'd underlined some parts of it, just because he'd liked them so much, and he was embarrassed about it now. "I think you're beautiful. The only beautiful person I've ever seen. I love your voice and everything to do with you, down to your clothes and the room you're sitting in. I adore you." Fortunately, Sirius didn't flip through the pages, only looked at the back cover, frowning slightly.
"Isn't this one of my uncle's?"
he asked.
"Yeah, you said I could borrow it."
Remus rubbed the back of his neck.
"Is it dirty?" "No." "Oh well, I'll read it anyway."
Sirius poked out his tongue.
"That can be my dare." "Very brave."
Remus grabbed the book back and shoved it in his bag. "But it's about—" Christopher frowned. They were almost at the portrait hole now, and Sirius stopped, making all three of them stop too. Sirius looked at Remus, raising an eyebrow. He nodded to Chris.
"He makes a lot of assumptions, this one."
Remus was surprised to find that his own cheeks were heating up too. He shrugged.
"He doesn't know you very well."
"Oi, Christopher!" Sirius shot him a very wicked look.
"Dare me to snog Moony?"
"What? Christopher looked stricken, as if he knew there was a joke somewhere, but he couldn't figure out the punchline. Sirius wasted no time. He took Remus's head roughly and pulled him in for a kiss. Remus gave in. It was a bit mean, but he could hardly refuse. If it was a test of loyalty or simply something Sirius thought would be funny, he had to go along with it. "Oh, for Merlin's sake!" A voice came from further up the corridor, causing Sirius and Remus to spring apart. "I'm away for a week and the castle turns into an orgy." All three boys spun round to see Marlene standing there in her travelling cloak, duffel bag at her side. She gave them a knowing smirk. "What a load of queers."
Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to our supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can head over to our Patreon or check out some of the official Bibliobabuli merch. If you're new here, consider subscribing, and until the next video, happy reading.